The needle stopped. Sarah had been sewing for so long that the stillness of her own hand startled her, the way sudden silence startles a person who has grown too accustomed to noise. She looked down at the manteau spread across her workbench, at the folds of deep ceremonial midnight blue that the royal ateliers had assigned to her 3 weeks prior, and she felt something she could not name pressing against the inside of her chest. Not pride, exactly. Not anxiety, though there was always anxiety, when the work was for the king. Something older than both. Something that moved through her fingers before her mind gave it permission, the way breathing moves, the way a heartbeat insists on continuing without being asked. The sigil was almost finished. She had been sewing it since before dawn, since the candles were still the only light in the long workroom, and the other seamstresses had not yet arrived to fill the space with their murmured conversations and the rhythmic percussion of their work. The pattern was complex, interlocking lines that spiraled inward and then outward again. Geometric, but somehow alive. A breathing thing made of silk thread, in a color so dark it was nearly invisible against the black furrow of the manteau's inner lining. Her grandmother had called it the prayer. She had never called it anything else. "You do not name sacred things, Seraphine," her grandmother used to say, pressing Sarah's small child hands against the old embroidery sampler that still hung above. The fireplace in the house where Sarah had grown up. You learn them the way you learn your own heartbeat. You do not name them, you carry them. She had carried it. Into every piece she ever made, from the first rough practice cloth when she was 6 years old, to the formal court vestments she now produced for lords and ladies who would never learn her name. She sewed the pattern the way other women said their prayers, quietly, privately, with a devotion she could not fully explain even to herself. It was simply part of what she made. It was simply part of what she was. The manteau before her was the most significant commission she had ever received. The ceremony of covenant renewal happened once every 25 years, and the garment worn by the Alpha King during the ritual was not merely formal dress. It was, according to every text she had been permitted to consult in the atelier's small reference library, a living document. The materials mattered. The construction mattered. The TEI. Intention of the maker mattered, or so the older seamstresses said, though they said it in the way people say things they believe without being certain they are permitted to believe them. Sarah had been selected because her stitchwork was the finest in Valdenmore's royal ateliers, possibly the finest in the kingdom, a fact that the head seamstress Madame Corval acknowledged with the particular reluctance of a woman who found it inconvenient that the best work came from the girl with no family. Name worth mentioning. She set the needle down and pressed her fingertips lightly against the completed sigil. The silk thread was warm. Warmer than it should have been. Warmer than the room. Warmer than her own hands that had been working through the pre-dawn chill. She told herself it was the friction of the work, the accumulated heat of hours of close attention. She told herself this, the way she told herself many things she was not entirely sure she believed. The door to the workroom opened, and Madame Corval entered, her posture as architectural as always, her silver hair pinned with the rigid precision of a woman who had decided long ago that softness was a luxury she could not afford. She crossed the room without greeting Sarah, which was not unusual, and stopped beside the workbench to examine the manteau, with the expression of a person who is looking for something to criticize, and finding the search more difficult than anticipated. "The outer embroidery is acceptable, Madame," Corval said finally. She touched the collar with 2 fingers, turning it slightly. "The lining detail is excessive. No one will see the interior of a ceremonial manteau, Seraphine. The king will not be turning himself inside out for the court's inspection." "The interior is part of the garment," Sarah said. She kept her voice even. She had years of practice keeping her voice even. "The intention of the maker matters. That is what the reference texts say." Madame Corval looked at her with the particular expression she reserved for moments when Sarah said something that was technically correct, and therefore impossible to argue with and therefore annoying. "The ceremony is in 4 days. Have it finished by tomorrow morning." She turned and left, and the room was quiet again. And Sarah looked back down at the sigil in the lining and felt that wordless pressure in her chest again, insistent and nameless, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be recognized. She did not know then what it was waiting for. She would know soon enough. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The court of Valdenmoor, on the morning of the covenant renewal ceremony, was a thing of orchestrated spectacle. Sarah had seen formal court occasions before, had in fact dressed many of the participants in those occasions, had spent years standing in the peripheral spaces of grandeur while the people she clothed moved through the center of it. She knew the geometry of these events, the way hierarchy arranged itself in space, the way power positioned itself so that everyone in the room understood, without being told who mattered and who did not. She knew it the way servants know things, intimately and without illusion. She stood now in the left antechamber of the great ceremonial hall, the manteau folded over her arm, waiting for the signal from the king's chamberlain that would allow her to enter the dressing room and perform the final fitting. Around her, lords and ladies in their formal regalia moved like a current she was not part of, voices overlapping in conversations about politics and alliances and the particular anxieties of a court that was about to participate in a ritual none of them fully understood, and all of them treated with the performative reverence of people who had decided that reverence was strategically advantageous. Sarah watched them with the calm attention. She had trained into herself over years of being someone no one watched back. She had found, a long time ago, that invisibility had its uses. "You are the seamstress." It was not a question. The voice came from her left, low and precise, with the quality of a voice that was accustomed to being heard without having to raise itself. Sarah turned. The woman who had spoken was somewhere in her middle years, dressed in deep green that had been selected with the kind of care that looks like effortlessness. She was beautiful in the way of someone who had worked at beauty long enough that it had become structural, built into the way she held herself, the angle of her head, the particular steadiness of her dark eyes. She was also, Sarah knew immediately from the sigil pin at her shoulder, Councillor Vael, the king's senior advisor, and the most politically powerful woman at court, the kind of woman about whom other women spoke in careful voices. "I am," Sarah said. Councillor Vael's gaze moved to the manteau on Sarah's arm, with an assessment so practiced it was nearly invisible. "The ceremonial garment is typically prepared by a senior member of the atelier. Madame Corval has filled that role for the last 2 renewals." "Madame Corval assigned this commission to me," Sarah said. Which was true, though the assignment had been more complicated than that, had involved Madame Corval's arthritis making fine work difficult, and her pride making acknowledgement of that fact impossible. So, the solution had been to assign the work to Sarah, while retaining nominal oversight. Sarah had no interest in explaining any of this. "Interesting," Councillor Vael said, in the way that people say interesting when they mean something else entirely. Her eyes moved back to Sarah's face with the quality of someone filing information away. "I hope the work is adequate to the occasion. The covenant renewal is not a ceremony that forgives inadequacy." She moved away then, absorbed back into the current of the court, and Sarah stood very still for a moment with the manteau on her arm, and the distinct feeling that she had just been evaluated, and the results of that evaluation were not yet known. The chamberlain appeared at her elbow 12 minutes later. "His Majesty will receive the garment now." The dressing room adjoining the ceremonial hall was smaller than she had expected, and quieter, the thick walls absorbing the sound of the court outside, until only a low murmur remained, like a tide heard from the wrong side of a wall. There were 2 of the king's personal attendants present, both men who acknowledged Sarah's entrance with the impersonal efficiency of people accustomed to managing the practical requirements of royalty. And there was the king. Sarah had seen King Cailan before, in the way that people who work at court see the king, at a distance, in formal contexts, the figure of authority around which everything else organized itself. She had not been in the same room with him before. She discovered now that there was a difference, a significant difference, between seeing someone from across a crowded hall and standing 8 feet away from them in a quiet room. He was taller than she had realized, with the contained physicality of someone in whom power was structural rather than displayed, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself because the room adjusted to it automatically. His face was composed in the careful neutrality of a person who had learned to manage what his expression communicated, but his eyes, dark and direct, moved to her with an attention that felt unexpectedly complete, as if he were actually seeing her, as if he had decided, in the moment she entered, that she was worth seeing. She reminded herself that this was the king, that kings looked at people who brought them things, that this was simply the ordinary attention of someone receiving a significant ceremonial object. And she moved forward with the manto and performed the professional ritual of a final fitting with the trained composure she had built over years of dressing people who mattered more than she did. She unfolded the manto and held it for him to settle his arms into the sleeves. He did so. His attendant stepped forward to adjust the drape at the shoulders, and Sarah moved around him to check the fall of the fabric, the alignment of the outer embroidery at the collar, the way the deep blue settled against the formal black of his other garments. Everything was correct. The work was, as it always was, precise. She was making the final check of the left shoulder seam when he went still. Not the ordinary stillness of someone submitting to the small adjustments of a fitting, a different kind of stillness, the kind that happens when something internal stops. She noticed it first in the quality of the silence around him, the way his attendants seemed to register it without understanding it, exchanging a glance over his head that she caught in her peripheral vision. "What is in the lining?" he said. His voice was the same, low and precise, but something underneath it had changed. Some frequency she felt more than heard, a resonance that moved through the air between them like a sound below the threshold of ordinary hearing. Sarah paused. "Embroidery, Your Majesty. A traditional pattern. It is positioned in the interior lining and will not be visible during the ceremony." "Show me." She hesitated only a fraction of a second before reaching to fold back the lower edge of the manto, exposing the interior. The sigil was there in its dark thread against the dark lining, almost invisible unless you knew to look, unless the light caught it at the right angle. She held the fabric so that the light from the high windows crossed it, and the pattern emerged the way things emerge when seen correctly, all at once, inevitable. The king looked at it for a long time, long enough that his attendants shifted slightly with the discomfort of people who did not understand what they were witnessing and therefore could not determine whether to be concerned. Long enough that Sarah's arm, holding the folded fabric, began to ache. Long enough that she had time to understand, with a clarity that arrived before she had words for it, that something had changed in the room in a way that was not going to be changeable back. "Where did you learn this pattern?" he said. It was not a question this time either. It was something more careful than a question. "My grandmother taught me," Sarah said. "She called it the prayer." Kaylin turned from the folded fabric and looked at her directly, and she felt that look the way she felt the warmth of the embroidery thread under her fingers, as something physical and inexplicable, as something that preceded understanding. "What was your grandmother's name?" he said. Sarah told him. She watched his face as she did, watched something move through the careful neutrality of his expression like a current moving under still water, and she did not know what it meant, but she understood that it meant something, that she was standing in the middle of a significance she could not yet see the shape of. "The ceremony will be delayed," he said to his attendants, and his voice had returned to its full authority, the voice of a man accustomed to decisions landing with the weight of law. He looked at Sarah again. "You will remain." The attendants left. The door closed, and Sarah stood alone in the quiet room with the King of Valden Moor and the manto she had made, and the sigil she had sewn without knowing what it was, and felt the ground beneath her understanding shift in ways she did not yet have language for. The delay of the covenant renewal ceremony sent a vibration through the court that was almost physical, a collective tension that moved from person to person in looks and whispered words and the particular stillness of people who are trying to appear unconcerned while being very concerned indeed. Counselor Vile felt it move through her with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years learning to read rooms, and she felt something else alongside it, sharper and more personal, the cold intelligence of a threat not yet fully visible. She had planned this ceremony with the patience of someone who understood that power is not taken in single decisive moments, but accumulated over time, positioned and repositioned, until the taking is merely the last step of a very long walk. Her position at Kaelin's right hand was secure, yes, but positions of power are never truly secure, only maintained, only defended, only renewed. The covenant renewal was meant to be a renewal of her position as much as of the ancient pact. She had arranged everything with care. Who stood where? Who was seen speaking with whom? Which symbolic gestures would be performed in whose presence? And now the ceremony had stopped for a seamstress. She did not know yet what the seamstress represented, but she had been at court long enough to know that when a king stops a ceremony to speak privately with an invisible person, the invisible person has just become very visible indeed, and everything that had been arranged around her invisibility needed to be rearranged very quickly. Sarah, in the dressing room with the king, knew nothing of what was happening in the hall outside. She was focused entirely on what Kaelin was saying, or rather on the way he was saying it, with a carefulness that she recognized as the caution of a person who understands that words, once spoken, cannot be retrieved. "The pattern you have sewn in this garment," he said, "is called the founding sigil. It is, as far as every scholar in Valdenmoor has been able to determine for the last 200 years, unique to a single lineage. The lineage of the Covenant founders, the family that sealed the original pact between the Lycan Pax and the human settlements of this region. A family that has been considered extinct since the shattering." Sarah looked at him. She felt very still, the way she felt when a piece of work required absolute precision, every other sensation narrowing to the point of the needle. "I do not understand what you are telling me," she said. "I know," he said, and something in his voice that she could not entirely name, something that was not quite gentleness, but was the shape of gentleness, moved through the words. "I am telling you because I think you deserve to. Understand what you are carrying before it is explained to you in a context that does not give you that dignity." He paused. "The founding sigil cannot be replicated. It is not simply a pattern. It is, according to the original covenant texts, a living mark. It carries the essence of the bloodline. It appears, the texts say, through the hands of those who carry that blood, even those who do not know they carry it. It cannot be copied from observation. It cannot be learned from instruction alone. It emerges from the blood." The silence in the room was complete. "My grandmother taught me this pattern," Sarah said carefully. "Your grandmother carried the blood," Kaelin said, "and her grandmother before her. The line did not end at the shattering. It went underground. It forgot itself. Or perhaps it chose not to know itself, because knowing was dangerous." His eyes held hers with that complete attention that she had noticed when she first entered the room, and she understood now that it was not the ordinary attention of a king receiving a garment, had never been that, had been something else from the first moment, though neither of them had known what to call it. "You are the last of the Covenant founders' line, Seraphine, and you have just sewn the founding sigil into the garment I am about to wear at the Covenant renewal." Sarah set the folded edge of the manto down very carefully. She needed her hands to be doing something precise. "And what does that mean?" she said. "Practically, for today." Something moved at the corner of his mouth that might, in different circumstances, have been the beginning of a different expression. "It means," he said, that the ceremony cannot proceed as planned. And it means that a great many people in that hall are about to have their understanding of the world adjusted significantly. He looked at the manto, at the visible line of dark stitching at the fold where the interior had been revealed. It also means that whatever you thought you were doing this morning, sewing alone before dawn, you were doing something considerably more consequential. Sarah thought of her hands moving in the pre-dawn quiet, the needle following a path as familiar as breath. She thought of her grandmother's voice. You do not name sacred things. You carry them. She knew, Sarah said. It was not a question. She knew, Kaelin confirmed, and his voice was gentle, the way the truth can be gentle when the person delivering it understands that gentleness is not the same as softness. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The return to the ceremonial hall was the longest walk Sarah had ever taken. She was aware of it in her body as a physical thing, the distance between the dressing room door and the center of the great hall, the way it seemed to expand as she walked it, the way the eyes of the assembled court landed on her like weight, like pressure, like the accumulated force of every moment. She had ever spent being invisible, now reversed into its opposite. She walked 2 paces behind Kaelin, which was the position his chamberlain had indicated she should take, and she held herself with the posture her grandmother had insisted on, back straight, chin level, eyes forward, as if you have every right to be exactly where you are, Seraphine, because you do. The court was silent in that particular way that rooms full of people become silent when something has happened that they do not yet understand but recognize as significant. Councillor Vielle stood at the front of the assembly, her expression composed with the perfect control of someone working very hard not to show what they are feeling, and her eyes moved from the king to Sarah, and back with a calculation that never stopped, that Sarah could see even from a distance, a mind always already in the next moment, always already rearranging the pieces. Kaelin stopped in the center of the hall, where the ceremonial circle was drawn on, the stone floor in silver dust, and turned to face the assembly. Sarah stopped 2 paces behind him. She was aware of the manto he wore, the weight of her own stitches, the sigil sewn into the lining that no one else could see, and she felt it the way she felt it when she had pressed her fingers against the finished work in the early morning. Warm, warmer than it should have been. The covenant renewal will proceed, Kaelin said, and his voice carried without effort through the great hall, the way voices carry in spaces built to receive them. However, the proceeding will be modified. The traditional ceremony requires the presence of representatives from both founding lines. For 200 years, this court has conducted the renewal with only the Lycan line represented, because it was believed that the human founding line was lost. He paused. Not for effect, Sarah thought, but because some things require a pause. It has been found. The silence in the hall changed texture. Sarah felt it as a physical shift, the air becoming something denser, more charged. The descendant of the Covenant founders stands in this hall, Kaelin said. She has been working in this palace for 3 years. She made the garment I am wearing. She has been carrying the founding sigil in her hands without knowing its name. He turned then, and looked at Sarah, and the full court turned with him, and she felt those hundreds of eyes with every nerve she had. But she did not look away. Her grandmother had told her, very specifically, not to look away. Her name is Seraphine, and she is the reason the covenant can be properly renewed today for the first time in 2 centuries. What followed was not silence. It was the sound of 200 people processing simultaneously, which is a complicated and layered noise, not loud exactly, but dense, the murmur of comprehension arriving in waves. Sarah stood very still and let it move around her, and thought about the needle going through the silk before dawn, the path that was as familiar as breathing, and understood that her grandmother had known this would happen, had prepared her for it in the only way she could, had given her the tool and the practice and the steadiness before giving her the knowledge, because the knowledge alone would not have been enough. Counselor Vale moved. Sarah saw it in her peripheral vision before she saw it directly. The slight forward shift of someone who has decided that waiting is no longer the correct strategy. She crossed the space between the front of the assembly and the center of the hall with the controlled deliberateness of someone accustomed to making movement look inevitable. And she stopped beside Kaelin with the physical ease of someone who had stood beside him many times and intended to make that familiarity visible. "Your Majesty," she said, and her voice carried its own kind of authority, polished to a high finish. "The covenant texts do establish the requirement of both founding lines, but they also establish the requirements for verification. A claim of lineage requires more than a needle and thread." Her eyes moved to Sarah, with an expression that was not cruel, exactly, but was the precise and cutting thing that sophisticated cruelty becomes when it has learned to dress itself in the language of procedural concern. "I mean no disrespect to the young woman, but the court would be remiss in its duty if it accepted an extraordinary claim without extraordinary evidence." Sarah felt the shift in the room, the way the counselor's words landed, the way they gave people who were uncertain a framework for that uncertainty. She was not afraid, exactly. She was something more specific than afraid. She was very awake. "The verification is standing in front of you," Kaelin said. His voice was even. "The founding sigil cannot be replicated. This is documented in the covenant texts, the same text you are referencing. It emerges through the bloodline, or it does not appear at all. I have had the pattern in the lining of this manto compared against the original stone carvings in the archive hall this morning. They match in every particular, including elements so fine they require magnification to see. There is no possibility of forgery. There is no possibility of coincidence." Counselor Vale was very good, Sarah had to acknowledge, watching her. She absorbed this information without any visible fracture, her composure holding like well-constructed architecture, absorbing a load it had been built to handle. "Then perhaps the young woman herself would speak," she said, and turned to Sarah with an expression of such careful courtesy that it would have been almost impossible to read the challenge beneath it, if you were not, as Sarah was, very practiced at reading the things people do not say. "Tell us, Seraphine, what do you know of your lineage, your family's history, the origins of the pattern you sew?" Every eye in the hall, every breath held or released. With deliberate calm, Sarah felt the weight of it and felt something else. Something she had been feeling since Kaelin had first said, "You are the last of the Covenant Founders' line." A warmth moving upward through her chest that was related to, but not identical to the warmth she had felt in the thread that morning. Something opening. Something that had been waiting the way seeds wait, with a patience that is not patience but simply the nature of things that grow slowly. "I know," Sarah said. And her voice was steady, clear, carrying through the hall in a way she had not entirely anticipated, as if the space were receiving it differently than it had ever received her voice before. "That my grandmother gave me a pattern she called the prayer, and told me to carry it in everything I made. I know that I have sewn it into hundreds of pieces of work over 15 years, and that every time I sew it, it feels like remembering something I was never formally taught. I know that my grandmother came to this region during the period your histories call the Shattering, with nothing but her craft and her children and whatever she carried in her hands." She paused. Not for effect, because some things require a pause. "I did not know, until today, what I was carrying, but I carried it correctly, and it arrived where it was meant to arrive." The warmth in her chest was stronger now. She understood, in a way she could not have articulated but felt with complete certainty, that this was not simply emotion, not only the feeling of a person in an overwhelming situation. It was something biological, something inherited, something that had always been in her blood, in the lineage her grandmother had protected by making it small enough to be invisible. And that was now, in this hall, in front of these people, recognizing itself. Counselor Vale looked at her for a long moment with those dark, assessing eyes, and Sarah looked back, and something passed between them in that look that was not yet resolution, but was the beginning of understanding what the terms of resolution would be. Vile was not simple. She was not a villain in the flat sense. She was a woman who had spent decades building a position she believed served the kingdom, who saw that position threatened, who was intelligent enough to know when a fight could be won and when it needed to be reconsidered. What she was calculating now, behind those composed eyes, Sarah could not entirely read. But she could see the calculation happening. And she could see, faintly, like something beginning to surface through deep water, the possibility that it was moving in a direction other than opposition. The procedure for verification, Counselor Vale said, and her voice had shifted by a fraction of a degree toward something that was not quite acknowledgement, but was, perhaps, the beginning of it, is contained in the 4th scroll of the Covenant Archive. I will have it retrieved. She looked at Kaelin. With your permission, you have it, Kaelin said. And Vile withdrew, not retreating, not defeated, moving with the dignity of someone who has chosen to adjust her position rather than be forced from it, which is, Sarah thought, an important distinction. People like Vale did not lose. They recalculated. The Chamberlain organized the proceedings with the practiced efficiency of a man who had dealt with ceremonial disruptions before and understood that the key was to make disorder look like a slightly different kind of order. The assembly was directed to the outer hall while the verification scroll was retrieved. Kaelin remained in the ceremonial hall with Sarah, and the attendants withdrew to a respectful distance that was still technically present, because kings are never truly alone in public spaces. He came to stand beside her, not in front of her, not at the formal distance appropriate to a king addressing a subject. Beside her, close enough that she was aware of him as a physical presence, close enough to catch the particular warmth of someone standing within the radius of their own contained energy. You did well, he said quietly, for her alone. I told the truth, Sarah said. That is not the same as doing well. Truth is not an achievement. In a court, he said. It sometimes is. He was looking at the silver circle on the floor, at the ceremonial geometry drawn there, and she looked at the same thing, and they stood for a moment in the shared quiet that exists between people who have just been through something significant together and have not yet sorted out what it means for what comes next. I am sorry, he said, for the abruptness of it. There was not a slower way to do it that would have served you better. But I am sorry for the shock. My grandmother prepared me for shocks, Sarah said. She simply did not tell me what kind. She felt his attention shift to her, the full quality of it, and met it. May I ask you something? Yes. When you touched the manto, when you first went still, what did you feel? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, that the question had crossed some line she had not seen. Then he said, recognition, the kind that arrives before understanding, the kind that is not chosen. He paused. My wolf recognized the sigil, the way a wolf recognizes a bloodline. Not a stranger's bloodline, something older than that. Something that belongs to the same covenant that created my own line. He turned to look at her then, and she met his eyes, and the look was not the look of a king examining a subject, or a man examining a woman. It was something simpler and more complicated than either. The look of a person who has just understood something they have been moving toward without knowing it. The covenant did not only bind territories and peoples. The original texts, which very few people have read, describe the bond between the two founding lines as something more specific than political alliance. Sarah felt the warmth in her chest again, that opening sensation. How specific, she said. Specific enough, he said, that I would like you to read them yourself before I say more, because you deserve to encounter that knowledge in your own time, in your own understanding, and not have it handed to you by someone else who has had weeks to process what you have had hours. He looked away again, back at the silver circle. What I can tell you is that what I felt when I touched the manto is something my wolf does not do casually, and it has never done it before. The warmth moved through her like a tide, unhurried, certain of its own direction. The verification scroll was ancient. Sarah could see, when it was unrolled on the table, the chamberlain's staff had arranged in the ceremonial hall, that the vellum had the particular color of things that have absorbed centuries, a deep amber that was not the absence of white, but the presence of time. The writing was in the old formal script, which the court scholar translated with the careful precision of a man who was very aware of the significance of getting each word correct. The verification process, as described in the scroll, was not what Councillor Vale had perhaps hoped it would be, meaning it was not a complex bureaucratic procedure with multiple points of failure. It was, in the way of the oldest traditions, elegantly simple. The founding sigil, the scroll said, was not only a mark that the bloodline produced. It was a mark that the bloodline recognized. Specifically, it would respond when brought into contact with the alpha stone at the center of the covenant. The large flat rock of pale gray, embedded in the floor at the center of the ceremonial circle, in a way that nothing without true founding blood could replicate. The scholar looked up from the scroll at Sarah with the expression of a man who has just understood that history has arrived personally. The verification requires the descendant to place her hand on the alpha stone while wearing or touching the sigil, he said. If the blood is true, the stone activates. If the blood is not true, it does not. He looked at the stone, which had sat in the floor of the ceremonial hall for 300 years, looking like a slightly unusual piece of masonry. It has not activated in 200 years, since the last covenant renewal with both lines present. The court had been allowed back into the hall for the verification. Sarah was aware of them as a presence, a weight of attention and breath, and the low-frequency energy of collective anticipation. She was aware of Kaelin standing at the edge of the ceremonial circle. Watching her with the still quality that she had come to understand was not blankness, but its opposite, the complete attention of someone who has learned to hold significant feelings very quietly. She was aware of Councillor Vielle, positioned precisely, watching with those dark, assessing eyes that had shifted in quality over the course of the morning, had moved from calculation against to something more complicated, something that was beginning to incorporate the possibility of calculation. Alongside, Sarah walked to the center of the circle. The silver dust of the ceremonial markings was undisturbed around the alpha stone, which was exactly what it had looked like in descriptions she had read. A flat pale gray rock, knee-height, slightly irregular in shape, embedded in the floor with the stability of something that had been there so long it had become structural. There was nothing obviously remarkable about it. It looked like a stone. She was holding the edge of the manto's lining where she had folded it back earlier, the interior exposed, the sigil visible in its dark thread. She knelt beside the stone and placed her palm flat against its surface and pressed the folded lining against the back of her hand so that the embroidered sigil lay between her skin and the cold surface of the rock. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened, and then the stone began to glow. It was not a dramatic light, not a flash or a flare. It was the light of something remembering itself, warm and steady, rising from deep within the pale gray the way light rises in the east before the sun itself appears, the first announcement of something coming. The warmth moved from the stone through Sarah's palm and up her arm and into her chest, where it met the warmth that had been building there since morning, and the two things found each other the way rivers find the sea, with a certainty that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with direction. The sigil in the lining, between her hand and the stone, heated. Not painfully, the way the thread had been warm before dawn, but more intensely, more purposefully, the way something feels when it is doing exactly what it was made for. Sarah watched the light grow and felt it in her blood, and thought of her grandmother's hands guiding. Her small fingers along the pattern, the prayer, the thing without a name because you do not name sacred things, and understood that her grandmother had known this moment would come, had been preparing her for this moment all along, had given her steadiness before knowledge, because steadiness was what this moment required. The great hall was completely silent. Every person in it was watching the stone glow with the particular quality of attention that only arrives when something is happening, that no one alive has seen before. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. The light did not fade immediately. It held for a long time, steady and warm, and then subsided gradually, the way a fire subsides when the intention is to leave embers rather than darkness. Sarah remained kneeling for a moment after, her hand still on the stone, now cool again, but feeling somehow different under her palm, the way places feel after something significant has happened in them. Then Kaelin was beside her. She became aware of him through that particular quality she had come to associate with his proximity, the warmth and the complete attention. And she looked up and found him already extending his hand to help her rise, a gesture so natural that she accepted it before she had thought about accepting it, and stood with his hand still holding hers, and was aware that the entire court was watching this moment, and found that she did not, at this particular instant, care about that in the way she might have expected to care. The verification is complete, the scholar said, unnecessarily, into the profound quiet. The founding blood is confirmed. Both lines are present. The covenant renewal may proceed. The proceeding was, in the end, simpler than it might have been. The scroll outlined the roles of both founding line representatives, the Alpha King for the Lycan line, the founding descendant for the human line. Their parts were parallel, a set of words spoken in response to each other, a set of gestures performed in coordination, the physical and verbal enactment of the original promise. The court scholar walked Sarah through her portion twice in a low voice, while the assembly resettled itself, and she found that the words, though she had never seen them before, sat in her mouth with a familiarity she could not explain, the way the sigil sat in her hands, as if her blood already knew them and was simply now being given permission to speak. They stood across the Alpha Stone from each other, within the silver circle, and spoke the covenant words into the air of the great hall that had not heard them in 200 years. And Sarah felt with each word the warmth in her chest grow more defined, more certain, more like itself, until by the last exchange she understood that what she was feeling was not simply the emotion of the moment, not simply the significance of what she was doing. It was the bloodline. It was the living inheritance her grandmother had carried and her grandmother before her, generations of women who had kept something alive through the years of forgetting, who had passed it forward in thread and pattern, and the instruction not to name what is sacred, only to carry it. She was carrying it now. She was carrying it into its fulfillment. When the last word was spoken and the last gesture completed, the Alpha Stone glowed again, briefly, a pulse of light that moved outward through the silver dust of the ceremonial circle like a ripple through water, touching the edges of the hall, and then releasing, and the covenant renewal was complete, and the hall erupted into sound. The days that followed were not simple. Sarah had not expected them to be. The revelation of a founding bloodline after 2 centuries of believed extinction was not the kind of thing a court absorbed immediately, the kind of thing that settled overnight into new understanding and required no further adjustment. There were meetings with scholars who needed to document her lineage for the historical record, consultations with the Covenant archivists who required her account of what had been passed down, formal audiences with lords and ladies who had been dismissive of her 3 days ago and were now performing the elaborate social recalibration of people who have discovered that they were wrong about something important and are trying to manage that discovery with as much dignity as possible. Sarah found, to her own surprise, that she had more patience for these adjustments than she might have anticipated. She understood what it was to not know something, to carry something without understanding what you were carrying. She could extend a certain gentleness to people who were rearranging their understanding of the world, because she was also rearranging her own, and doing it in the full view of a court that watched her constantly now, with the hungry attention of people who find significance. Compelling. Counselor Vielle requested a private meeting on the third day. Sarah considered this carefully, and agreed. They met in one of the smaller reception rooms, without attendants on either side, which had been Vielle's specific request, and which Sarah had accepted because she found she trusted her own ability to read the room more than she feared what might happen in it. Vielle arrived exactly on time, dressed with the same effortless precision as always, and they sat across a small table from each other with tea that neither of them drank, and Vielle looked at her for a moment, with those dark eyes that had, Sarah thought, finally stopped calculating and started simply observing. "I underestimated you," Vielle said, without preamble, without cushioning. Direct in the way of someone who has decided that directness is the correct strategy. "I want to say that clearly. Not because I believe you require the acknowledgement, but because I think the honest statement serves us both better than the polite fiction that I was simply doing my procedural duty when I challenged the claim." Sarah looked at her steadily. "You were also protecting something," she said. "A position you built and believed in. That is not nothing." Vielle's expression shifted slightly, the careful composure softening by a fraction. Not weakening, adjusting. "You are more generous than I deserve." "I am accurate," Sarah said. "Generosity implies excess. I am telling you what I actually think." She paused. "I do not want your position, counselor. I do not understand politics well enough to want power in the way that you wield it. What I know is thread and pattern and the architecture of things that need to hold together under pressure. That is what I know." She met Vielle's eyes directly. "I suspect the kingdom needs both things. And I suspect you are intelligent enough to know that." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had preceded it between them. Not charged with opposition. Not loaded with calculation. Quieter. More honest. "You suspect correctly," Vielle said. And then, for the first time since Sarah had encountered her, she smiled. A real one. Brief and unperformed. "I will be watching you, Seraphine. Not in the way I was watching before." She picked up her tea at last, and held it between both hands. "In the way that one watches someone they intend to learn from." Sarah returned to her work in the ateliers that afternoon, or tried to. She found that the workroom, which had been her entire world for 3 years, felt different now. Not smaller, exactly, but differently shaped. The way spaces feel when you have seen them from outside, and understand that they are contained within something larger than themselves. Her workbench was exactly as she had left it, needle resting where she had set it down before dawn on the morning of the ceremony, a lifetime ago, 3 days ago. She sat down and picked up the needle and felt the familiar weight of it, and was grateful, deeply and specifically grateful, that this had not changed, that the work was still the work, that the thing in her hands that had always felt like prayer still felt like prayer, even now that she knew what the prayer had been for. She was sitting like this, needle in hand, not yet working, simply being still in a space that was familiar, when she became aware of someone in the doorway. She knew who it was before she turned, the way she had known things about him from the beginning of it, with that sense that arrived before language, before thought. Kaelin stood in the doorway of the seamstress's workroom with the slight self-consciousness of a king in a space he does not usually occupy, which Sarah found unexpectedly endearing. He looked around at the long benches and the bolts of fabric and the particular organized chaos of professional needlework, and then at her, and something in his face that had been held very carefully over the days of procedural intensity since the ceremony relaxed slightly. "I did not know where else you would be," he said. "This is where I am," she said. He came into the room and stood beside her workbench, looking down at the fabric and the needle with the same attention he gave everything. "How are you?" he asked. And the simplicity of the question, after days of significant events and formal procedures and the elaborate vocabulary of courts, landed with a directness that made her breath catch very briefly. "I am rearranging things," she said. "Inside. The understanding of what I am, what I carry. It takes time." "I know," he said. He sat down on the stool across the workbench from her, which was not a thing kings did in seamstresses' workrooms, but he did it with such naturalness that it seemed like the most reasonable action available. "I have been thinking about what I said to you, about the covenant texts, about what they describe." Sarah set the needle down. "I read them," she said. "The archivist gave me access." "And?" She looked at him across the workbench. The winter light came through the high windows and fell across the fabric between them, across the needle she had set down, across his hands resting on the edge of the bench. "The texts describe a bond," she said, "between the two founding lines, not only political, not only ceremonial." She paused. "They use the word recognition, the same word you used." "Yes," he said. "Is it?" she began, and then stopped, and began again, because this was not a question she could approach sideways. "Is what you feel something the bond creates? Something that is happening to you because of bloodlines and covenant and the mechanism of old magic? Or is it something you would feel regardless?" He was quiet for long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. 8. Then, "I have been asking myself that question for 3 days. I think it is the wrong question." He looked up from the fabric and met her eyes. "The bond recognized what was already there. That is what recognition means. The covenant did not create the feeling. It saw it. The way the stone saw your blood. The way your hands know the pattern before your mind gives them instructions." He paused. "I have been in this court for 15 years. I have managed alliances and treaties and the politics of a kingdom that never stops requiring management. I have made decisions based on what serves the realm. I have not, in 15 years, sat down on a stool in a workroom because I did not know where else to be." His voice was even, but underneath the evenness was something very simple and very true. "You are where I want to be. That is not the bond speaking. That is me." The warmth in Sarah's chest was not surprising anymore. She had stopped being surprised by it. She let it be there, steady and certain, and looked at the man across the workbench from her, the king who had recognized her name in the sigil she had been sewing since childhood, who had stopped a ceremony to tell her the truth before anyone else could shape it for her, who was sitting on a seamstress's stool because that was where she was. "I need time," she said, "to understand what I am, what I carry, what my life is now. It has changed very completely and very quickly." "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to wait," she said carefully. "I am asking you to let the time be what it is, not to press it into a shape it is not ready for. That is not how I do things," he said. "The covenant texts call the bond between the lines an unfolding, not a declaration, an unfolding." The edge of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the first cousin of one. "I can live with an unfolding." She looked at him for a moment, this careful and contained man who had the gravity of a king and was sitting on a stool in her workroom, and felt the unfolding he had named, felt it as a physical thing, the slow certainty of something that grows because that is its nature and cannot be hurried without being broken. "So can I," she said. She picked up the needle. He did not leave. He sat across the workbench and watched her work, not intrusively but companionably, the way people keep each other company when words are not the thing the moment requires. After a while, he asked about what she was making. She told him. He asked another question, about the thread, the technique. She answered. The conversation moved the way rivers move, finding its own direction, not forced, simply going where it was inclined to go, and the afternoon light shifted across the fabric, and the needle moved, and the thing between them unfolded at exactly the pace that was right for it. This was not an ending. Sarah understood that clearly, the way she understood the structure of a piece before she had finished it, the sense of the whole that informed the making of each part. This was a middle, a significant and pivotal middle, but a middle nonetheless. There would be more adjustments and more procedures and the ongoing work of understanding what her new position in the world meant, and how to occupy it with the same integrity her grandmother had occupied her hidden, invisible life. There would be more conversations with Counselor Vielle, who was formidable and recalibrating, and Sarah suspected would become something important to her understanding of the court, neither ally nor adversary in simple terms, but something more nuanced than either. There would be the ongoing and patient and profoundly real experience of learning to exist alongside a man whose wolf had recognized what his mind was still learning to name. But underneath all of it, in the way that foundations are underneath everything visible, was the certainty she had felt when the stone glowed, the warmth of her blood recognizing itself, the prayer her grandmother had given her finally knowing what it had been praying for. She had carried it correctly. It had arrived where it was meant to arrive. And the rest, all of it, the unfolding and the learning and the living of a life she had not anticipated, was not a thing to be afraid of. It was simply the next thing she would make with her hands. 3 months passed in the way that months pass when they contain significant amounts of living, quickly in retrospect, and slowly in the experience of them. Sarah moved from the shared dormitory where seamstresses of the lower ateliers lived into a set of rooms in the palace proper. Not grand rooms, not yet, but private ones with a window that caught the afternoon light and enough space for a proper work table that she assembled herself, to the polite bewilderment of the 2 palace servants who had been assigned to assist her and could not understand why she preferred to do it herself. She understood why. There are things you need to build with your own hands. There are shapes that need your direct intention in the making of them. She continued to work. This was not something anyone had told her to do or required of her. It was simply who she was. She worked now under a different designation, no longer as a journeyman seamstress of the royal ateliers, but as something that the court archivists had spent 3 weeks trying to find the correct historical precedent for, and had eventually settled on calling the Covenant Artisan, a title that Sarah found slightly more elaborate than necessary, but was willing to accept because the work it referred to was genuinely her own. She was commissioned to create the ceremonial garments for the renewal verification process that would formalize the restoration of the founding bloodline in the historical record, and she worked on these with the same focused devotion she had brought to everything else, not because the task was ceremonially significant, though it was, but because the work itself required it. She also, gradually, and with the patience that the situation required, began to learn the things she had not known. The history of her lineage, retrieved from archives, and the memories of elderly scholars who had preserved knowledge that had seemed irrelevant and turned out to be critical. The nature of the covenant bond, which was not magic in the way that word was commonly used, not external and imposed, but something more akin to recognition, a deep structural affinity between bloodlines that had been woven together at the founding of the kingdom and retained that weaving across generations. The political geography of Valdenmoor, which was more complex than she had understood from the position of an atelier seamstress, and which Counselor Vielle, true to her word, had begun to teach her in their twice-weekly meetings, which had evolved from the careful negotiation of uncertain parties into something approaching the genuine exchange of 2 people who found each other's minds interesting. And Kaelin, who came to her workroom 3 evenings in the 7 of every week, not always at the same time, not formally, but reliably, the way things that have found their direction become reliable, who sat across the work table and asked about the embroidery she was working on, or told her about the council meeting that had frustrated him, or sometimes was simply present without requiring conversation, the companionable quiet of two people who have realized they are comfortable in each other's silence. He did not press her. She did not press herself. The unfolding unfolded. She understood the bond now, from the texts and from the experience of it. It was not the complete overwhelming thing of the stories she had occasionally read in her dormitory years, the sudden certainty and instant belonging of the romantic ideal. It was more interesting than that. It was the recognition of something true, and then the long, patient work of building around that recognition, of constructing the architecture of genuine knowledge, genuine trust, genuine intimacy. The blood knew. The rest of the person needed time to catch up, and the time was not a deficiency, but a gift. She had been given the knowledge before the feeling. She was letting the feeling grow into its own true shape. The formal ceremony of bloodline restoration, which the court archivists had determined was the appropriate procedure, and which Kaylin had insisted on keeping as simple as the court would permit, took place on the morning of the winter solstice. Sarah was dressed for the first time in garments made by someone else's hands, specifically by Madame Corval, who had offered the gesture with the particular grace of a woman who knew when a gesture was required and made it without being asked. The gown was deep blue, the same deep blue as the ceremonial manteau, and there was nothing superfluous about it. Madame Corval had excellent taste when she was not being defensive about it. The court assembled in the great hall, the silver circle repaired and redrawn, the alpha stone gleaming dully in the winter light. Sarah stood at the edge of the circle and felt the hall as she had felt it on the morning of the covenant renewal, the weight of collective attention, the particular charged quality of a room full of people who understand they are witnessing something that will be in the historical record. She felt it differently now, not as the weight of invisibility reversed into exposure, as something more straightforward, as her life, happening, in the presence of witnesses. Kaylin stood inside the circle, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen there in the 3 months of evenings at her work table, something that had come forward now in this public setting that the privacy of those evenings had not required. He was watching her cross the space toward him with an openness that the careful neutrality of his public face had always occluded, an openness that said, clearly and without the mediation of language, that this mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with covenant or bloodline or the formal requirements of ceremony. He was looking at her. He was looking at Sarah, the woman with needle-worn fingertips, who talked about thread with the same seriousness that he talked about governance, who had told him she needed time and had taken exactly the time she needed, and not apologized for it, who had sown a prayer she did not understand into everything she made and had been right to do it. She came to stand across the alpha stone from him, inside the silver circle, and the scholar began the ceremony, and she spoke her portion when it was time, and he spoke his, and the formal words of bloodline restoration were entered into the record of the covenant in the same ancient script that had recorded the original founding, and the stone glowed briefly in the way it had glowed on the morning everything changed, warm and certain and without drama, the light of something simply being what it is. After the words, and before the witnesses, while the hall held its collected breath, Kaylin reached across the alpha stone and took her hand. Not a ceremonial gesture, not prescribed in any scroll, simply a choice, made by a man in a public place, to take the hand of the person beside him, to make visible the thing that had been present in all those quiet evenings, without requiring announcement. His hand was warm, and hers was warm, and the stone between them glowed for a moment longer than it technically needed to, as if it were also, in its ancient and unhurried way, content. The hall released its sea breath, and the sound that rose was warm and complex. Not the bewildered murmur of the day everything changed, but something more settled, the sound of a court that had had time to adjust, and had, largely, chosen to accept the adjusted reality. There were exceptions. There would always be exceptions. There would be the ongoing work of politics and positioning, and the careful navigation of a status that was new and complicated, and required constant attention. She knew this. She was not naive. She had spent 3 months learning enough to know how much she still needed to learn, but she also knew the warmth of the man holding her hand across the stone, and the warmth of her own blood, doing the thing it had always been built to do, and the warmth of the needle in her workroom waiting for her to return to it, and the warmth of the prayer her grandmother had given her arriving, finally, completely, at the place it had always been traveling toward. She had carried it correctly. That was what her grandmother had asked. Carry it correctly, Seraphine. Keep it in your hands. Do not let it become a secret you keep from yourself. She had carried it into a hall full of witnesses, and set it down, and picked up a different kind of work. The kind that would take the rest of her life. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming?